Tathagata's true meaning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I have spent probably the most of the last month looking into the nature of Buddhanature. It's all because of Bill. It's your fault, Andrew. Buddhanature is probably one of the most fractious concepts that we have in Buddhism. And it has a very interesting history. Its investigation has appealed to me very greatly because it involves archaeology, it involves the recension of a lot of sutras, a lot of arguing, and it's an interesting idea. And I'm going to start by talking about a very different kind of idea in another religion that actually has some similarities to Buddhanature. I'm going to start talking about what happened in Lyon, France in 1245. In 1245, Lyon, which was the seat of the church at that time, the Catholic Church, held a synod. And one of the main items on the agenda of this meeting was the question of purgatory. The church was debating whether or not to include the idea of purgatory into its canon, into its teachings. As it turned out, it was a stroke of genius, because the church, in creating the idea of purgatory, and let me read you how they defined it. An intermediate state after physical death in which those destined for heaven undergo purification so as to achieve the holiness necessary to enter the joy of heaven. In other words, what the church was offering to its members was a chance of redemption. Instead of having a clear-cut choice between heaven and hell, we now have purgatory, which is sort of an intermediate, it was sort of a transitional condition. And of course, they made it possible for the living to have some effect on their progression through that transition through the sale primarily of dispensations. In other words, if you had the feeling that Dad was not good enough to get into heaven and might be in purgatory, you could go and buy a dispensation from the church that would help his cause in purgatory and help him get to heaven a little bit sooner and not undergo all the tortures that existed there. It's an interesting idea because it gave the members of the church an opportunity to practice. And it gave them the opportunity to, it gave the clergy the opportunity to write sermons on this subject. And it occurred to me that this idea of purgatory is not very different from the Buddhist notion of Buddhanature. Buddhanature didn't really come into existence, or it didn't really become an element of the Dharma, of the Buddhist Dharma, until about the second half of the 3rd century CE. That period of history in Buddhism was a very active period because that is when the Mahayana came into existence. It is when a number of sutras were finally written down, and a lot of them rewritten, and some of them simply invented. You know, you have to remember something that is very important in Buddhist history, well, in the history of the world. And that is that the first scrap of Sanskrit writing that we have was written on a bit of papyrus and found along what's the name of the route north of the Himalayas?
I mean the
Silk Road?
The Silk Road.
Silk Road.
It was found along the Silk Road in the middle of the 19th century. That is the first piece of Sanskrit writing that existed. So,
What about Pali? Is there any evidence of Pali writing?
no,
Did they have a written language?
no. The first language, the first actual language that was not actually written down, is to be found on commemorative stelae, on stone tablets. But you have to remember, and this is very important, that the sutras as we know them today, including the Pali Canon, was not actually written down until after the death of Christ, which is 500 years after the death of Shakyamuni. And there are many sutras, like one very important sutra, and a sutra that contained the first mention of Buddhanature, which in Sanskrit was, it was called Tathagata Garbha, which Tathagata was the Buddha, and Garbha was the embryo or the seed of Buddhism, of the Buddha. In the sutra in which the first mention of this is made is the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, which I have had occasion to talk about many times. It's a sutra describing the last days of the Buddha's life. And there are, as it turns out, many different versions of this. The one in the Pali Canon, or what we now call the Pali Canon, is quite different from the other 10 or 11 versions that are clearly written with the Mahayana in mind. There is a distinction, there is a distinct difference between what we read in what we call the Pali Canon and what we read in the Mahayana versions of those sutras. And one of the things that is mentioned in the Mahaparinirvana Sutra that clearly belonged in the Mahayana camp is this business about the Tathagata Garbha and an explanation of what it was. Now, there are a lot of historians who believe that the Mahayana followers believe that Buddhism, as it had been practiced up until then, was very nihilistic, with its emphasis on no self and suffering and emptiness. It's not a salesman's dream. You know, I can understand how all that works together. Why don't you come in and get a...
I got one to get some.
With its emphasis on emptiness and suffering and no self, it was felt that they needed to have something to sell, something to give the practitioners hope. And Buddhanature was a way of doing this. The idea of Buddhanature was a way of doing this. Well, what was their conception of Buddhanature at that time? In the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, it gives 9 examples of what Buddhanature was like. The first one is, it's like the calyx of an unopened lotus blossom. It's like honey still in the comb. It's like unthreshed grain still in the husk. It's like gold and ore, like a treasure buried beneath a poor man's house. Like a seed still in its hole. Like a Buddha image wrapped in a dirty cloth. Like one destined to become a world rule while still in the womb. Like a golden statue still enclosed within its clay mold. In other words, they had a very concrete notion of what Buddhanature was like. It was something that all people had inside themselves, and it was like an embryo or a womb that, through practice and through patronage of Buddhism, would be revealed, so that you would become, in fact, like the Buddha. Now, this really creates a problem, doesn't it? Because in Shakyamuni's world, everything is impermanent. There is nothing that abides. There is nothing that can be passed from one generation to another, and there is nothing that, like a soul or a self, that exists. So Buddhanature, in its early stages, really set up a sort of tension between the belief in impermanence and the belief in something manifestly permanent, if everybody is said to have Buddhanature as part of their makeup. And in fact, that's the way they put it in the final sections of the Mahaparinirvana Sutta. And Buddha suggests that this sort of depiction of the Tathagata Garbha is a strategy for converting non-Buddhists to his teachings. This is why it occurred to me that it's very much like the Catholic conception of purgatory. It gives you something to sell. It gives you something to work on. And, it's an interesting idea because you can sort of think that the whole idea that we have behind what we call enlightenment and realization, or satori, or kensho, or even bodhi, is something that is revealed and worked on and progressively acquired. Now, Buddhanature did not become very important in Japanese Zen. Not to the extent that you find in China and Tibet, and particularly in Tibet, where it is of immense importance in their teachings. But it became important enough that Nagarjuna talked about it. Of course, he was Indian, but it was something that Dogen picked up on, and he wrote a very large fascicle on Buddhanature called Busho in the Shobogenzo. Dogen gave an entirely different interpretation as to what Buddhanature was and how it operated. He, of course, did not believe that it was any kind of a permanent or manifested characteristic of sentient beings. He saw the world in a non-dualistic manner, and he spoke about it that way. And in his fascicle, he shows how this might be done. And the first thing that he does is he points out that human beings don't have Buddha nature. Human beings are Buddha nature. Secondly, he says, not only human beings have Buddha nature, but all sentient beings have Buddha nature. And he goes on to say that Buddha nature and time are very closely related. Buddha nature for Dogen is basically impermanence. And it is so complete that it's impossible to say whether we have it or don't have it. We can say yes or no to the question of whether we have Buddha nature. Dogen was not, he did not see our lives as being a progression. Dogen strongly promulgated the idea that everything, every moment, every temporal minute of our existence is complete in itself. And to talk about a characteristic which becomes manifested in a progressive manner didn't make any sense to him. So he talked about Buddhanature in the way that he talked about time, which he associated with being itself, and impermanence. There is nothing that exists permanently, and nothing which stands as an abstraction outside of our lives itself. One of the things that Dogen was always talking about was the oneness of practice and enlightenment. And we've talked about this many times in this room, the fact that when we sit down to do Zazen, we assume the character of Buddha. We manifest Shakyamuni himself. And practice, we do not practice in an attempt to attain some enlightenment in the future. It is instantaneous. And being and practice and enlightenment coexist together. There is no separation between any of those three things. I have often said that for me, my practice is the practice of accepting myself just as I am, with all of my faults and with all of the good things about myself. And I think that Dogen would agree with that. It's very important for us to realize that we are already realized. And as we practice, our existence, our being, is exactly time. It's one of the things that makes our practice so powerful. As Dogen said, he said, even if only one person sits for a short time, because this Zazen is one with all existence and completely permeates all time, it performs everlasting Buddha guidance within the inexhaustible Dharma world in the past, present, and future. In other words, time, impermanence, and Buddhanature is not something that exists as some sort of an abstract idea outside of ourselves. It's not something that we either acquire or we attain. It's something that we manifest. And every time we sit down on the cushion, we are manifesting our Buddha nature. Now, manifesting Buddha nature is not the same thing as saying that we acquire it. It's always there. We always have that. But manifestation is something a little bit different. It's not a little bit different. It's something that he says, he says in the very beginning of this fascicle, he says, Shakyamuni Buddha said, quote, living beings all are Buddha nature. The Tathagata is continuously abiding and not subject to change. Living beings all are Buddha nature. Buddha nature is no other than all are, because all are is Buddha nature. All are is not 100 broken pieces. All are is not a single rail of iron, as it is held up fist, as it is a held up fist. It is not limited to large or small. When it's called Buddha nature, it cannot be put shoulder to shoulder with all sages. It cannot be put shoulder to shoulder with Buddha nature. Buddha nature pervades the universe. It's virtually impossible to speak about it. Because, as he says, know that in the midst of all are, sentient beings are hard to find. If you thoroughly understand all are will be penetrated and dropped off. In other words, Buddha nature is so pervasive that we can say it exists, and we can also say it doesn't exist. We can say that, yes, a dog has Buddha nature, and we can say that, no, a dog doesn't have Buddha nature. Both statements are the same.
That would make a good koan.
Well, Dogen's conception of Buddha nature is quite different from the Mahaparinirvana Sutra's conception of Buddha nature. And in fact, he takes the sales advantage away. I don't know if you listen to that program on the radio on Saturday mornings. It's on for an hour at 7 o'clock, or no, at 6 o'clock. What's the name of it?
New Dimensions.
Yeah, New Dimensions. I've been listening to that program for, I don't know, 20 years.
Very brave of you.
No.
Well, it comes at a time when I have the radio on. I'm in the midst of fixing my breakfast, and you know, getting ready to have my Sunday morning, and the radio's on. And besides, it comes right before Weekend Edition, which I do like to listen to. But over those many years that I've listened to that program, most of the people who have been interviewed have been people who have expectations. You know, expectations.
And opinions. How to get there.
Well, purgatory, you know, gave the Catholic Church a great way of creating expectations.
And making a ton of money.
And making money.
And making a ton of money. But, and I think that the origin of Buddhanature in the beginning was an attempt to create expectations. You know, everybody's capable of becoming a Buddha. All you have to do is practice this way and,
Buy my book.
you know.
Buy my book.
Exactly,
That's what you mentioned.
exactly.
Probably look at this website, get an appointment.
But then in the 13th century, you have somebody like Dogen comes along, and he succeeds in making Buddhanature so big and so thoroughgoing that it encompasses everything. As a matter of fact, it encompasses so much that you can't talk about it. So how can you sell something that you can't talk about?
You wait for 2 generations and have Kazon do it for you.
Right, right. Well, yeah, but he had to come up with a lineage first.
No, yeah, he was a good salesman.
Yeah, that's right, that's right. The lineage is a good sales, and we're still selling it.
Yes,
Well, I thought that you would find it interesting to hear that about Buddhanature.
Thanks for clearing that up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I ask one question, even though it might muddy the, might be here forever? Everybody might not like that very much. Buddhanature and the Absolute. What's the relation, so?
Oh, that's it.
That's your next talk, all right?
No, I can't talk about that. I mean, I had a hard enough time talking about it this morning.
I just want to acknowledge your bravery in taking on own subject.
As well as new dimensions.
Well, yeah,
Yeah, they won't invite you on new dimensions.
Well, you know, it's a hard, it's interesting, because if everything is just fine as it is, especially yourself,
Oh, Suzuki Roshi had the answer to that one.
yeah,
You were all perfect, just as you are. And you could all use a little improvement.
right.
On that note.
Well, I sent Roshi a quote from Oscar Wilde this week. Did you get that?
I don't remember, what was it?
Be yourself.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Everyone else is already taken.
Take it, yeah.